Hello, and welcome to this Religion and Diplomacy conversation. My name is Judd Birdsall. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, and also the Project Director of the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy, the TPNRD. And today we'll be talking about India's religious diplomacy. And I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. One of the things that we do within the life of the TPNRD network is ask our participating diplomats what issues they are interested in, what issues they're working on, issues they're wrestling with, issues on which they would benefit from additional bespoke research. We make a list of those issues that they mention, we identify a couple, and then find scholars who can write papers on those topics and present them to our diplomats. And one of the issues that was raised earlier this year was India's religious diplomacy. And finding a scholar to write on that topic was not hard at all because Professor Ian Hall is an expert on Indian foreign policy. His most recent book is Modi and the Reinvention of Indian Foreign Policy. Ian Hall is Professor of International Relations at the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University in Queensland, Australia. He's also an academic fellow of the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne. And his research focuses very much on Indian international relations. Professor Hall, thank you so much for joining me today and for writing this paper that we are discussing now.
Thanks so much. Look, it was a pleasure writing the paper, and it's been a real joy being involved in this project over the last few months.
Wonderful. And to our audience, you can find the paper on our website, religionanddiplomacy.org. Well, let's get into our conversation about the paper and the issues that it discusses. As we were finalizing the paper, Professor Hall, we had some back and forth conversation about some of the key terms in the paper, the Hindu right, Hindutva, universal guru. I wonder if you could help, by way of sort of opening up this conversation, help us understand some of those key terms and how they're at play in contemporary Indian diplomacy.
So in the brief, I wanted to really address the brief and the topic in as broad a way as I possibly could. So I did want to position this discussion of India's contemporary religious diplomacy in terms of the broader Hindu right, rather than just the kind of Hindu majoritarian Hindutva movement, which inspires the current ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, and its underlying organizations, things like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. The Hindutva ideology runs through those organizations, but not all, if you like, Hindu nationalists with a small n, not all Hindu conservatives would necessarily subscribe to their narrow ideology. And if we look at the BJP's support base, it is like all major political parties in all major democracies. It's fairly broad. So it does encompass people who believe in this idea of Hindutva or Hinduness, or of transforming India and the Indian state, Indian society, to conform with their interpretation of Hinduism. But the BJP support base also involves a whole bunch of conservatives, with a small c, if you like, but also economic liberals who are opposed to the kind of the socialism, as they perceive it, of the Congress Party and some of the left-wing parties in India. So I wanted to try and make this paper as encompassing as possible, partly because the way that the BJP, the way that Narendra Modi has reshaped India's religious diplomacy is to appeal to as broad an audience as it possibly can.
Oh, thank you. And one of the things that I'm always struck by with when it comes to India, and I imagine others resonate with this, is just the conflicting images that we have of India. On the one hand, this vibrant, pluralistic democracy that embraces and celebrates all different faith traditions. And on the other hand, this increasingly majoritarian Hindu nationalist state that marginalizes its religious minorities. Obviously, it's a complex country with a huge population, but I'm wondering how you see it, how these conflicting images are at play in contemporary Indian foreign policy.
So those images are very much very current, and they're also, in a way, they are promoted by the current government, and they've been promoted by earlier governments as well. The the Hindu right would argue that those two things are actually compatible, that it's possible to have a Hindu majoritarian state where the Hindu majority gets to have the predominant say within politics, within society, within economics, within all of those things, and at the same time have kind of protections for religious minorities and maintain a vibrant democracy. A lot of outside observers, and I'd include myself in this, would say that there are actually tensions between those two different projects, which are probably irreconcilable, that it's not necessarily possible to have a state that is infused with Hindu ideas or ideals, to privilege Hindu culture, Hindu religious practice, and so on, not just within society, but also within the state. It's not possible to do those things without effectively marginalizing religious minorities, whether they're Christian, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Sikh or Jain, or a whole number of other minorities that exist within India. So I think the reality is that India at the moment is in a kind of a struggle between these two different conceptions of itself. Both of them still exist, they do coexist, but there are, I think, tensions between the two of them.
Thanks. One thing I learned, or two things that I learned from your paper, one that's in the paper, and one that I was prompted by your paper to Google and then learn was, so the first is that India has the smallest foreign service of any major power. And then I was also looking this up recently, that India has the largest diaspora in the world. And you talk about in the paper how a lot of this diplomacy, this religious diplomacy, is actually carried out by non-governmental entities, including the diaspora, or aimed at the diaspora in many places. Could you talk about that? How there's an official and an unofficial religious diplomacy?
Yes, it is one of the most extraordinary things about contemporary India. You know, a country that aspires to be a major power, that aspires to be a kind of convening power in global diplomacy. And we've seen that aspiration on show this year with the G20 that they've been hosting throughout most of 2023. So the fact that they have those aspirations and they have this tiny diplomatic service, smaller even than a country like Singapore's, is just really extraordinary. Now, they're investing more in that, but they have to invest in kind of necessary areas, and areas like cultural diplomacy, religious diplomacy, soft power, and so on, are not necessarily the areas where they want to make investments. So India does have this extraordinary diaspora. It is as varied and diverse as India itself. There are different parts of the diaspora in different places, and concentrated in different countries. So, for example, our diaspora here in Australia is quite different to the Indian diaspora in the United States. In the United States, the dominant group, if you like, economically, socially, is Gujarati, traditionally. In Australia, they're Punjabi and they're Sikh. So about 40% of our diaspora here is Punjabi. So we have this incredibly varied diaspora. But the existence of the diaspora, the size of the diaspora, the influence of the diaspora means that it's a really potent resource potentially for Indian governments. And since the 1990s, the Indian government has looked to the diaspora to try to augment and supplement its kind of traditional diplomatic activity through a whole range of kind of community-based activities, whether it's setting up newspapers or websites, whether it's holding, religious ceremonies or cultural events or things like that, or indeed whether it's promoting religious ideals. And we now have various different Hindu groups operating globally. In fact, they've been operating globally for quite a long time, for more than a century, in fact. But we're seeing more of these groups now setting up in various different places. Some of them attached to various different Hindu traditions or Hindu groups or Hindu godmen or swamis or religious leaders. Some of them, though, linked to the BJP and to the ruling party in India, and to some of the organizations that are connected to it. So I mentioned the RSS before. There's also the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the VHP, which is a right-wing Hindu nationalist organization, mostly in the north of India. They have a big international presence now amongst the diaspora, and so they are promoting messages that are much more supportive of the government than perhaps some of the other diaspora groups might be.
And related to the diaspora, one of the terms that one hears, particularly in the human rights field, is the concern about Hindu phobia. And I wonder if I could get your take on that. It seems like there's perhaps a combination of a principled concern for antagonism towards Hindus, but perhaps also a pragmatic use of that as a shield against criticism of contemporary India and the Modi government.
Yes, I mean, this is obviously an extremely sensitive and difficult area, and it's one that's a very emotive issue as well. I think there are some genuine concerns within the Indian diaspora and within the Hindu community that others don't necessarily understand what Hinduism stands for, or that they have kind of prejudiced beliefs about Hinduism. So there's acute sensitivity, for example, about the ideas of caste and practices around caste. And where caste is discussed in the West, there is a sense that it is discussed in an unfair or unreasonable way, or that the concept of caste is used to criticize India, whereas there's less self-criticism about, you know, potentially related issues like class and other kinds of prejudice within other kinds of countries. So there's a sensitivity there, which comes from the colonial past, which comes from criticisms of Hinduism as a religion and some Hindu practices, that runs all the way back into the colonial period and doesn't seem to have gone away, if you like. So there's a sense that there's an unfair prejudice towards Hindus, an unfair prejudice towards Indians, and some particularly in the diaspora, have captured this in this concept of Hindu phobia, which of course, you know, is deliberately connected to, you know, earlier concepts of Islamophobia and things like this. I think there are some, however, on the Hindu right who are using that term very freely wherever there is any criticism of India generally, or a criticism specifically of the Modi government or of the BJP. And that when that criticism arises, it's instantly labeled Hindu phobia, particularly on social media. And as you say, it's used as a kind of a shield against criticism. And sometimes that criticism is very legitimate. So this is a very increasingly sensitive area. We've only really seen this term emerge in the last 10 years or so, I think. But it's one term that I think we're going to have to watch the way it's being used, who's using it, and whether it's being used reasonably or unreasonably.
Thanks. It reminds me of very contemporary debates we're having now around definitions and uses of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, what those terms mean, who's using them, how expansively they can be used, especially when religious identity maps onto national identity or the activities of certain states. As this was a policy brief aimed at our diplomatic network, we had you also at the end offer some recommendations to us, and I wanted to focus on those now and ask you to perhaps expand on those a bit. The first two related to more research that you say can be done. So the first is there's a need for a thorough map of India's religious diplomacy and the many organizations involved in promoting Hindu nationalist agendas worldwide. And related to that, you said there is a need for better data on the impact of India's religious diplomacy and Hindu right activism on both diaspora communities and the foreign public opinion. Could I just ask you to elaborate a bit more on both of those? What would each of these look like in practice, the mapping and the data on impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think engaging in this project, writing this brief, I became aware of just how complex this picture actually is, and actually how little we know about some of the non-state actors that are promoting messages that are pro-government or anti-government indeed in India, some of the organizations that are promoting kind of overtly religious messages and ideals. So I think we have a fairly good understanding of India's official religious diplomacy, whether that happens through embassies and consulates or cultural centers, whether it happens through organizations like the Indian Council on World Affairs and the ICCR, or these cultural relations institute that India has. We've got a fairly good understanding of what happens there, and it's reasonably transparent because they publish annual reports and so on. But I was very struck with the paper. I've been in the past, but extremely struck when I was writing the paper at how many other organizations beyond the state are engaging in what we might call kind of unofficial religious diplomacy. And they're doing so with the encouragement of the Indian government. So a consistent theme of Narendra Modi's speeches is to say that the diaspora are ambassadors. He refers to them as Rashtraduts, which kind of means ambassadors of the Rashtra, ambassadors of the Hindu nationalist state. And we don't, at least I don't, at present, have a very good understanding of how those organizations work, what the overlaps between those organizations are, who the particularly important individuals are within those contexts, which organizations are closely affiliated with the BJP or with organizations like the RSS or VHP that I've mentioned before, and those organizations that may be more independent, and so on and so forth. So we've got kind of snapshots of that. So we have a reasonably good understanding in places like the United States. I don't think we have a particularly good understanding of what happens in Europe, in Asia as well. There's a whole panoply of think tanks and some religious leaders who are engaging in dialogue with Buddhist groups, for example, in lots of Southeast Asia, East Asia. And we've got some sense of who they are and what they're doing, but we don't have a very good map yet of all those various different organizations. And in parallel with that, we don't really understand what the impact of these organizations is. Just generally, the information that we have about public opinion about India outside of India is not great. There's not a huge amount of polling done on public opinion about India, and it's not done very regularly. We don't have a very strong understanding about how diaspora communities are responding to the various different messages that they're getting from New Delhi or from all of the various different unofficial organizations or proxies. We just don't have enough data at present to be able to judge whether all of this activity that we know is happening is having any particular positive or negative impact. So I think there's gaps there, and there's scope for doing some more work in those various different areas.
So the first two recommendations relate to more research that needs to be done. The third is about how the governments, particularly those that participate in the TPNRD, can respond. Let me read it and then have you respond to it or elaborate on it. So the recommendation is that there's a need for governments, particularly in Europe and North America, to establish strategies for managing and engaging with India's religious diplomacy and Hindu nationalist activism. And I'm wondering what recommendations you would have for what that engagement could look like, especially in this very difficult geopolitical context where Western countries look to India as a strategic partner and ally, but also, want to raise concerns about what's going on in India domestically, particularly when it comes to human rights and religious freedom.
So yes, as you say, this is a really challenging and difficult area. We are in Australia, at least and we've seen this in the United States and Canada and elsewhere as well. We're very deep into conversations about the limits or where the line sits between influence within societies and foreign interference, which can go across a line and cause problems for diaspora communities, cause problems in terms of the integrity of democratic processes and all of these sorts of things. So this has been, this has formed some of the background to some of the things that we're talking about here. My concerns, I think, specifically are that India, whether it's think tanks or whether it's non-governmental organizations or whether it's government institutes and so on, official channels, India is engaged in quite a lot of interreligious dialogue, but only with certain communities. So I've already mentioned the extensive work that's being done to engage Buddhist communities in East Asia in particular. There's some engagement being done as well with some Muslim groups, not across the board, but with particular organizations, particularly representing, say, the Sufis, who have been for a very long time present in South Asia and very prominent within the Muslim community. So Sufi organizations are being explicitly engaged. What we haven't seen is a lot of religious dialogue with Christian organizations and with so non-Buddhist, non-Muslim organizations. There's a concern within the Hindu community broadly, but also especially within amongst Hindu nationalists, that Christianity can tempt people away from Hinduism. There's a concern about conversion. And I think that's meant that we've not seen as much engagement with Christian communities as possible. But I think it would be very positive to have a much more open dialogue with Christian communities. But then, of course, too, from an official point of view, I think we do need to open up more dialogue and more conversation between governments and some of these organizations, the think tanks, particularly some of the leading organizations in India and outside India, about the activities that they're engaging in, and just get to acquire that stronger sense of their activities, their targets for their activities, their influence, their impact, and so on and so forth. There's a little bit of connection and conversation going on between our politicians as they engage with diaspora groups as they're electioneering, but there's much less going on at the kind of official level, but amongst government bureaucracies.
In that recommendation, you reference Europe and North America. You've also mentioned a couple of times in our conversation now Australia, where you currently are. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a bit more on the view from down under, the role that, or the current state perhaps of Australia-India relations, particularly as it relates to India's religious diplomacy, given your geographic proximity and also given comparatively large Indian diaspora community in Australia.
Yes, so the Australia-India story is a really quite extraordinary one. In 10 or 15 years, we've gone from a situation in which we have a very small Indian diaspora to one that is numbering almost 1 million people in a country of around 25 million. So it's a very significant change. We've also seen a very big change in the nature of the relationship, the diplomatic relationship, where we've gone from being quite distanced, from really not having a great deal of interest in each other, from some mutual neglect, to forming a quite close strategic partnership that covers defense and security issues, and which also is about trying to stimulate trade and investment, and which has this very significant people-to-people connection because of the diaspora and all of the things that they're engaged in. So we've seen this amazing transformation in Australian society and in the diplomatic relationship between the two countries in a very short space of time. Almost all of that has been positive in terms of both countries, but we are now getting to the point where I think the Australian government, the Indian government, needs to think carefully about the diaspora and about some of the organizations that are operating within the diaspora, most of which are acting in absolute good faith and are acting in very positive ways to promote social, cultural, religious connections between both the communities. But obviously politics intrudes in all of this as well. And we do have organizations operating within Australia that are trying to influence the diaspora, both in terms of supporting the BJP back home and supporting Hindu nationalist organizations back home, but also trying to influence the diaspora to vote for politicians who, in Australia, who may be more pro-India or less pro-India. Now that's, on the face of it, an entirely legitimate activity, but at times some of that activity, as we know from other cases in other countries, can sometimes cross the line from influence into interference, and then it becomes much more problematic. So we're just getting to that point now where we've got this incredibly fast maturing relationship where we're going to need to think a little bit more carefully about how we ensure that the diaspora is making the most positive contribution and flourishing in the way that it absolutely should, and ensuring that we don't have any problems emerging at a social level and also in the diplomatic relationship because of the activities of lots of different groups in this context.
Thank you. Maybe one final practical question for you, and that is for those viewers who want to dig deeper into this issue. Of course, they should read your paper on our website. They can check out your book on Modi and Indian foreign policy. Anything else you'd recommend for those who want to look more deeply into this issue?
Oh, look, I think what we've seen, I just say just generally, what we've seen also in the last 10 years is a real transformation in the quality of journalism that's being produced across the world on India. Although we're not seeing as many foreign correspondents in Delhi, we are seeing much better writing. And so whether that's, your leading newspapers in the United States, or whether it's leading organizations in Europe, or even the Australian Broadcasting Corporation here in Australia, has been doing excellent work in trying to translate some of the complexities of contemporary India and tell that story in a much better way than perhaps was done 10 or 20 years ago. So there's no one place to go. I just say, we are now in a very privileged position in having a huge, much better commentary about India in all of the various different media outlets than we had, just a few years ago.
Well, Professor Ian Hall, thank you so much for this paper and for taking the time to chat with me about it today. Many thanks.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for giving me this opportunity.
And to our viewers, thanks for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you on a future Religion and Diplomacy conversation.